Welcome back, everybody. We are going to go ahead and go over lesson 3, sources of bias. So we're going to get started with the main idea. Another sampling method that does not work is convenience sampling. As the name suggests, in convenience sampling, we simply include the individuals who are convenient for us to sample, like the surveys they give to people at the mall. Unfortunately, this group may not be representative of the population. Any systematic failure of a sampling methods to represent its population is bias. In this lesson, we'll be learning how to identify the different types of systematic bias and how to eliminate that bias in a situation so that our sample is able to represent the population parameter as accurately as possible. If you're asked to describe how to design a study, how the design of a study leads to bias, you're expected to identify the direction of the bias. Suppose you were asked, explain how using convenience sample of students in your statistics class to estimate the proportion of all high school students who own a graphing calculator would result in bias. And you can say, this sample would probably include a much higher proportion of students with a graphing calculator than in the population at large, since the graphing calculator is required for the statistics class. This method would probably lead to an overestimate of an actual population proportion. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the main sources of systematic bias. There are 4 different sources that we're going to go over in our class. So the first one is voluntary response bias. Bias introduced to a sample when individuals can choose on their own whether to participate in the sample. It's often hard to define the sampling frame of a voluntary response study, and samples based on voluntary response are always invalid and cannot be recovered no matter how large the sample size. People are more likely to respond if they feel passionately about the subject matter, which will cause an overestimate of the variable of interest. The next one that we're going to go over is undercoverage. So a sampling scheme that biases the sample in a way that gives a part of the population less representation than it has in the population. And this causes it to suffer from undercoverage. So for example, if you only take a random sample of 12th graders from Mrs. Rayburn's AP English class, but not in Mr. Hennessy's AP English language class, you aren't representing all the 12th graders equally. So you aren't repping 12th graders equally here. The next one is a non-response bias. So a bias introduced when a large fraction of those samples fails to respond. Those who respond are likely to not represent the entire population. Voluntary response is a form of non-response, but non-response may occur for other reasons. So this ties back to what we were learning before, right? So those that do respond are because they're passionate about the issue or the subject. Okay, so for example, a non-response bias would be those who are at work during the day may not respond to a fellow telephone survey conducted by calling them during work hours only. Okay. Next is a response bias. So anything in a survey design that influences response falls under the heading of response bias. One typical response bias arises from wording of the question, which may suggest a favored response. So voters are more likely to express support for the president than support the particular person holding that office at the moment. So if you say, for example, this is saying if the wording of the question said like the president instead of Donald Trump, this can influence how the answers will be given. So we're going to go ahead and do a model problem as an example. A local sports writer wants to know how strongly Katy residents support the Katy High School football team. She stands outside the stadium before a game and interviews the first 100 people who enter the stadium. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight some key terms. So sports writer wants to know how strongly Katy resident supports the high school football team. She stands outside the stadium before a game and interviews the first 100 people. Okay, so first, part A asks us to identify the population of interest. So this is all Katy residents. Okay, the sampling frame, which is where she takes the survey, is the Katy High School football game. And then the sample that was collected was the first 100 people. So these are like the actual people that she surveyed. Part B says discuss how bias was introduced through the sampling method and the direction of the bias. So this is a convenience bias, okay? Because she had people going to the game respond, and of course if they are the first 100 people, there's going to be an overestimate in support for the high school. Okay, so if you're one of the first 100 people to a game, it's more likely because you support that team than not supporting that team. C, describe a different way to collect a representative sample of the population of interest. So what she could have done is a randomization, meaning she would get a list of Katy residents and then do a systematic sampling method. Okay, this will this will eliminate the bias that might occur. Next, we're going to go ahead and get started on the check my understanding. So I want you to go ahead and pause this video, try the check for understanding yourself, then come back and check your answers with me. So, the check my understanding. A local newspaper wants to see how many people are unhappy with their current job. They told people to call in to a number and press 1 if they are happy with their job and 2 if they are unhappy. An overwhelming 89% of people said that they were unhappy with their job. Describe how bias was introduced, the direction of the bias, and a better way to collect the sample. So, this is a bias because only unhappy people will call in. So it shows an overestimate in the population. Okay, and a better way to collect the sample is to get a list of subscribers and do a systematic sample. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the 4 practice problems. Again, I want you to pause this video, try the problems on your own, and then play the video again to check your answers. So for the practice problems, for each of the following problems, we're going to describe how bias was introduced, a direction, as well as a better way to collect the sample. Okay, so number 1. The administration on campus wants to know how effective tutorials are for students. They decided to survey the first 30 students in the lunch line during the high school lunch, and then use that information to generalize for all of the high school. So this is a convenience bias because these students might find the tutorials helpful and finish their work early, which is why they're the first 30 students in line. So the best way is to counter this is to stratify sample and get a random number of students from each grade. Okay. Number 2, a local newspaper asked subscribers to respond to the question, if you had to do it over again, would you have children? An overwhelming, so going back to this actually, the direction of this bias is that this is an overestimate. Okay. Back to number 2, a local newspaper asked the subscribers to respond to the question, if you had to do it over again, would you have children? An overwhelming 70% of more than 10,000 people wrote in and said that they would not have kids again if they could have a do-over. So this is a response bias. Only people who really don't want kids would respond. So this is an overestimate. And then to counter this, we can get a list of subscribers. List of subscribers and do a systematic sample. Okay. Moving on, number 3. The school wants to see how parents would feel about all students attending mandatory summer school for 3 weeks in July. They randomly select 200 families for the survey, and 75 of the 98 families that responded were in favor of summer school program. So this would be a non-response bias, since a lot of people didn't respond, and then those that did show an overestimate because they are passionate about summer school. So SS is summer school. To counter this, they should call all 200 families during a time where everyone, or I wouldn't say everyone, where most people are home. Okay. Number 4, the last one. A legislator wishes to know how his district feels about a particular issue. As a result, his office emails a long, detailed survey about the issue to a random sample of adults in his district. So this would be a non-response bias, since not everyone has emails or checks them. Okay, so this would be an underestimate. So what he can do is either mail a survey or go door to door. Okay, that concludes lesson 3, which talked about the sources of bias.